My name is Michael Frumkin, and I'm the organizer at this University of Miami Law School seminar on the constitutional crisis. Our topic today, for the final seminar in this series, is life during a constitutional crisis. And our speaker is Bernard Harcourt, who's the Curtis Lamont Professor of Law and Civil Liberties at Columbia Law, and a faculty affiliate in, count them, 1, the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, 2, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, and 3, the Department of Political Science at Columbia University. Professor Harcourt is also the founding director of the Initiative for a Just Society at the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought, which brings contemporary critical theory and practice to bear on current social problems and seeks to address them through, among other things, litigation and public policy transformation. His biography is equally complicated and impressive. He has an A.B. from Princeton University, a J.D. from Harvard Law School, and a Ph.D. from Harvard University. After law school, he served as a law clerk for Judge Charles Haight Jr. on the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, then represented individuals on Alabama's death row at what is now the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. Professor Harcourt taught at the University of Chicago, where he was chairman of the Political Science Department and the Julius Kreeger Professor of Law and Political Science before moving to Columbia. He's been a visiting professor at Harvard University, New York University, and the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. He continues to represent pro bono persons sentenced to death and life imprisonment without parole, as well as those detained in Guantanamo Bay. In 2019, Professor Harcourt was awarded the New York City Bar Association Norman J. Redlich Capital Defense Distinguished Service Award, a Lifetime Achievement Award for his work on behalf of individuals on death row. Professor Harcourt also served on human rights missions to South Africa and Guatemala, and has actively challenged the Trump administration's Muslim ban, representing pro bono a Syrian medical resident excluded under the executive order, as well as Mozeb Zitan, a Columbia SIPA student. I'm a longtime fan of Professor Harcourt's scholarship, which includes more than a dozen authored or edited books on a wide variety of important topics in political, social, and legal theory, political economy, punishment practices, and critical philosophy. To name only some of them, his most recent book, Cooperation of Political, Economic, and Social Theory, offers a blueprint for society based on cooperation. His other recent book, Critique and Praxis, A Critical Philosophy of Illusions, Values, and Action, charts a vision for political action and social transformation. Earlier books include, don't worry, I won't name them all, The Counterterrorism, How Our Government Went to War Against Its Own Citizens, Exposed, Desire and Disobedience in the Digital Age, The Illusion of Free Markets, Punishment and the Myth of the Natural Order, and one of my favorites, Against Prediction, Profiling, Policing, and Punishing in an Actuarial Age. In addition, Professor Harcourt has edited or co-edited and annotated many volumes of the lectures of the philosopher Michel Foucault in French and in English, as well as the French edition of Discipline and Punish. His French connection extends to Professor Harcourt being a directeur d'études at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. It is our privilege to welcome the public intellectual, Bernard Harcourt, to conclude this semester's seminar series on the constitutional crisis. Professor Harcourt, the microphone is yours. Thank you.
I am only one generation away from fascism. I grew up in its shadow. My father, who was born in Paris before the war, fled France in June 1940. He escaped through Bayonne in the Basque country on a sardine boat, headed to Portugal, to Porto, where he remained for a few months, trying to get a visa to the United States, which he finally obtained and ended up in the port of Elizabeth, New Jersey. He was accompanied by his older sister, who, when she got to New York, pretended she was older than she was and joined the Free French. But because she was young, she was first sent to North Africa and then to London.
I grew up listening to their stories, their huddled conversations about whether they'd need to leave the United States and flee again. I grew up with their insecurities. But this was in the America of the 1960s, 70s, 1980s, during the Vietnam War, yes, but it felt so safe here. Never in my life did I ever think that I would have to flee the country where I was born, like my father. And it's so odd now, in a way, for the first time in my life, and late in life, to realize that this might happen to me too. As myself a vocal critic of President Donald Trump, when all of a sudden people who are even permanent residents here in the United States are being expelled for criticizing the government. I can't really understand fully how I led my whole life never thinking that this could possibly happen to me. Led my whole life in such a carefree way, even though, right, I lived in the shadow of my parents' journey. And so I wanted to start there with our last discussion question, which asks, how have the people around you reacted and responded? Do you feel that you have been touched by these crises? And I should say that actually, yes, I have been touched by these crises. I wanted to start there at the end and to work back, because in a way, I myself never realized how insecure things could become. So I wanted to start there with fascism, really, in the 1930s. And later, then we could move to our own crisis. Because we're trying to understand what it is to live in a constitutional crisis, in a democratic crisis, in some kind of crisis that we need to name. So we should start at the beginning, in a way, going back in history, and maybe, start by addressing some of the later questions we have, like the question we have: what would you list? What would your list consist of in terms of recommendations, and how many recommendations would you come up with? So to do that, I wanted to talk about two movies, two real-life movies. The first is a movie called One Life. I don't know if any of you have seen it. If you haven't, I would recommend it. It's Anthony Hopkins plays in it, so it's well acted. It came out in 2023. And it's a true story of the life of Sir Nicholas Winton, who was a British banker, a British broker, a man in finance in London, a relatively young man at the time, who traveled to Prague in Czechoslovakia for his work. And as a result of his travels to Prague and in Czechoslovakia, he started to become familiar with the place and its residents. And he was there in December 1939, December 1938, actually, January 1939. The German army had just annexed Austria, and they were beginning to move into Czechoslovakia. The Allied nations, France and England, had given Hitler a pass and basically allowed him to do these annexations so long as, in order to avoid military conflict. And as a result of the German annexation and effectively invasion, refugees were beginning to cluster in Prague. Tens of thousands of refugees. Sir Nicholas Winton was there on business, but he became increasingly moved and personally affected by the thousands of refugees, and particularly the thousands of refugee children who were there in Prague. And so he got this idea that maybe what he had to do was to help the children escape and get to England. And so he started working with some people who were working on refugees and a refugee organization to set up what became known as kinder transports, the transport of children from Prague, mostly Jewish children, but not exclusively Jewish children, the children who were basically refugees in Prague with their parents most of the time. But he felt that he could get visas for the children and get them out, even if he couldn't get the parents out. And so what he organized, and so he was down in Prague, and then he went back to London. He was working with people in Prague. He was working in London with the English government to get visas for the children. And of course, to do that at the time, you would have to transport the children through Germany, Holland, on a train. So it was a multi-journey trip at a time when these were all refugees trying to escape Germany. So it was a tricky effort, a tricky endeavor. But against all odds, he was able to get permission from the parents of the children, which was already complicated, and as well from their spiritual advisors, from the rabbis, to get the lists of the children, which of course was difficult because everyone was fearful of what could be done with those lists. To get visas in London, which each visa required like £50. It was very expensive to get the visa. He had to set up families who would take each child, who would agree to foster the children, had to create paperwork, had to create photographs. I thought I would share with you, there's a beautiful archive online of the whole experience. And here you have one of the letters written by him where he's explaining that there's going to be a first transport. This was the 29th of November, 1939, and they were going to be transporting about 200 children, and they'd be accompanied by 8 adults, and that they would have to go through Germany, and they would go through Holland, explaining it all. And then, of course, and he was able to get a first convoy of about 200 children through Holland. And these were, for instance, the children, right? Transport via Southampton, Hamburg, December 28, 1938, right? Heinrich Buchler, who was 15 years old, Ulrich Caro, who was 11 years old, Helmut Stefan Einstein, who was 5 years old, 15, 9, of all ages. And it was remarkable that he was able to do that. He was able to get 8 convoys out of Prague. The 9th was boarded, and the children were ready to go when, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and all hell broke loose. And the children were not allowed to leave, and they were taken off the trains and mostly sent to camps. Overall, he was able to save 669 children on those kinder transport trains, who were then fostered and raised by English families. during the war, and who would end up living and continuing to live with those families after the war, and staying there and actually only knowing those parents because their parents were sent to the camps. Winton, it's a remarkable story in part because the BBC finally gets a hold of this story in the late 1980s, and actually, unbeknownst to Winton, brings together the children on a TV show. And so I don't want spoiler alert, but he does get to meet the children who get saved. Of course, Winton did not look the other way, right? He steadfastly tried and worked hard to get those visas and set up those transports. And it was thanks to him that those lives were saved. The second movie is less well known. It's a movie from 2017. It's called A Bag of Marbles. It's a French production. It's about two young boys who must have been around 10 and 14, who lived with their family in Paris. They lived with their father and mother. Father was a barber. Two older brothers who were in their 20s. They too were barbers. It was a family, and they lived there with mom. And they were Jews. They were in Paris, 1939, 1940, and essentially the Jewish codes come into effect. They have to start wearing the yellow star, and ultimately the parents decide that the boys need to escape and leave for the free zone, which was in the southern part of France. France got divided into two. The northern part was occupied. Paris was occupied by the Nazis. The free French zone was Vichy France, but there were certain freedoms that were allowed there and ways to survive. And so the two boys, it's a story of their kind of journey to the free French zone to try and get reunited. The mother and father and the two brothers, the two brothers had already left. The mother and father would leave, but they just couldn't all travel together. And they try to reunite in Nice, which is down on the coast, on the Mediterranean coast in France. And to get there, the two boys, it was a series of happenstances. And that's what's so interesting about the movie. I mean, the movie is very compelling, but what I would find particularly interesting and want to talk about are the series of happenstances of ways that they were effectively saved by small acts by adults. At one point, they're on a train with many refugees, and the Germans stop the train, board the train, and start arresting everyone. And there was an older priest who noticed that they were all by themselves, and essentially he told them to come sit next to him. And he gave them each an apple and had them sit next to them, told them not to be worried. And as a result of that, he was able to kind of convince the German military, as they were passing down the corridors, that the children were with him, and they were able to survive and stay on the train. Another person was actually a coyote who helped them cross the border to the free zone. He was doing it for 1,000 francs at the time. They had the money from the father, so he wasn't doing it out of the goodness of his heart, but he was risking his life, right, to get them to cross the border. Another was a priest in Nice who made a false baptism certificate for the two boys to suggest that they had been baptized as Catholics. Another was a Jewish doctor, actually, who was working for the Nazis before he himself got deported, but who certified that they were not Jewish. And the last puzzlingly, was actually a collaborator, a family man, very, very conservative, very much in favor of the German occupation in a small town in the Free Zone. His son was a member of the French milice, which was the militia at the time. But somehow he took one of the boys in and had him working. And what was particularly interesting was at the end of this movie, or at the end, there's the liberation, and the resistance is about to execute the collaborator for being a collaborator. And the young boy, in a way, saves his life by saying that he had taken him in. And he says, he knew I was Jewish, which one doesn't get the sense of that from the movie, because he was such a hardened collaborator that it seems unlikely that he would have taken in a Jewish boy. But but the boy said that, and as a result, the collaborator was spared execution. Now, why do I start there? I start there in part because these are the acts of strangers, right? Winton, the priest, Ph.D, the Jewish doctor, even maybe the collaborator, acts of strangers that saved people during crises. And I wanted to start there because the question becomes, right, what kind of acts do we need to be taking in a time like this, in a time of the constitutional and democratic crisis? Now, of course, it'll depend on how you understand the crisis or what it is that you think that we are experiencing. And so to kind of set up the answer or to get to those questions, or, how have you reacted? How have you responded? How should we respond? It's important to really get a sense of what the crisis is that we are facing. And of course, you've had a whole semester of trying to address this. And I'm sure I've watched the seminars. You've had many of these terms flying about: autocratic legalism, Kim Shepley, competitive authoritarianism, patrimonialism, and democratic backsliding, and descent into fascism. So you have heard all these terms and all these different diagnoses. And so what I thought would be helpful in this final seminar to set up the discussion is to organize them in a way, try and make sense of these different ways of describing the constitutional crisis, the democratic crisis. It'd be helpful to have a framework, right? To help organize all the different positions, and also for me to locate my own argument, which I have given you in the readings, which I call the modern counter-revolution. Now, the best framework, I think, to understand all of these different theories is to understand that they all rely on, implicitly or explicitly, on a before and after account of American democracy, right? Now, some only describe where we are headed, for instance, authoritarian legalism or fascism, in the case of the Timothy Snyder readings that we had for today. Some focus mostly on the transition or the mechanism of the transformation in the middle, before and after. So these are arguments about polarization, populism, or democratic backsliding. And then, of course, some focus really on the causes. What is it that is bringing about these democratic crises? It's technological innovation, it might be labor markets, it might be inequality. But the important point is that they all, oftentimes implicitly, but they all describe a transformation of American society from a before to an after, and offer an account of the dynamics of that change. In this sense, they are classic social theories, right? That's what the classic style of social theory is about. It's an interpretation of a structural transformation of society, much like de Tocqueville's book, L'Ancien Régime et la Révolution, which goes, for instance, from the Ancien Régime in France, which was Louis XVI and the monarchy, to later periods like the post-revolutionary France. And so to understand the possible breakdown of American democracy, you need to start with an account of what American democracy was like in the early 21st century, say maybe 2000, 2010, 2015, perhaps before the first election of President Donald Trump. You then need a kind of a diachronic story, a dynamic theory about transformation that can address both the mechanisms of how things are transforming and the underlying social and economic political forces that are bringing it about. And then finally, of course, you need an analysis that is a description or a diagnosis of where American democracy or American Constitution stands today in 2025 and where it's headed. Okay, so let's take those in turn. The first place, then, is the before, turn of century America, circa 2010, let's say. Essential to begin there because if you believe there's been a descent into fascism, or if you believe that it's just the same as before, it's going to turn on unstated assumptions about what American democracy looked like before. And one of the best ways to do this is to look at something like the Democracy Index. Okay, that's a working group from The Economist. It's actually the magazine, The Economist. They have a working group called the Economist Intelligence Unit, the EIU, that ranks countries based on 4 political categories, whether they're a full democracy, a flawed democracy, a hybrid regime, or an authoritarian regime. They use 60 variables associated with measures of political participation, democratic culture, pluralism, process, respect for civil liberties. And at least until 2016, at the time of the first election of Donald Trump, The Economist ranked the United States among the most democratic in the world. So the US was called a full democracy at the top tier of the Democratic Index. That year, though, in 2016, the EIU dropped the United States to the category of a flawed democracy, so the second category. A flawed democracy is defined, by contrast to a full democracy, as one that has fair elections and respects some civil rights, but suffers from weak governance or low levels of participation in elections or low trust in political institutions, or it might have troubling infringements on civil liberties and erosions of the ordinary political checks and balances. So if you look at that index, basically the United States had begun to slide towards kind of a flawed democracy by 2016, and that would have been the before moment. Now, democratic regimes can also be characterized as consolidated democracies. That's another big term in political science. It's a term coined by Juan Linz, who is a political scientist who really did a lot of the coinage of all of these democratic terms, Linz and Alfred Stepan. And they were looking mostly at transitions to democracy. So countries in South America that were transitioning. And a consolidated democracy, by contrast to what they call a weak democracy, is reserved for emerging democracies that began to feel as if democratic processes were considered as the only game in town. That's the way they kind of describe it. So consolidated democracy is one in which democratic processes are the only game in town, and that they define that along 3 dimensions: a constitutional dimension, an attitudinal dimension, behavioral dimensions. Consolidated democracies basically are regimes in which all of the players are bound by the laws and institutions, where public opinion overwhelmingly believes in the democratic method to resolve disagreements. None of the major actors are putting their energy in trying to create a non-democratic regime or trying to secede from the democracy. Now, you can think of these, of course, all as quantitative measures of full or flawed or consolidated or weak democracies. You could also think of qualitative descriptors, such as a pluralist democracy, which is how we like to think of the United States. The pluralist idea here is that there are different competing interests and groups in societies, and that those different competing interests resolve disagreement and competition by means of compromise and adjustments. Okay, so that's the idea of pluralism. That's what we call American democracy, generally a pluralist or a liberal democracy, one that has an anti-majoritarian checks and balances. We generally call those kind of embedded liberalism, but that raises questions of political economy. Some people refer to the United States more as a neoliberal democracy, or and then start talking about the problems of capitalism as well. So you had in the readings discussions from Naomi Klein and Astrid Taylor on the rise of end-time fascism, but basically those are critiques of the kind of democratic process that we have that would align with some other critiques, like Nancy Fraser, who talks about cannibal capitalism, or Cedric Robinson, racial capitalism, or disaster capitalism. Naomi Klein is known, of course, for the term disaster capitalism, or late stage capitalism for the Frankfurt School. Okay, now, so you're going to have very different views about where we're coming from. And for some people on the left, prior to the 2016 elections, or prior even to the 2024 elections, there was a sense that actually there's not that much difference between the traditional parties, the Democratic and the Republican parties. Now, many people at the time, 2016, 2024, argued that Hillary Clinton was a compromised candidate in 2016, a hawk, kind of a neoliberal with Wall Street ties, not that different from Donald Trump. Some argued there was little difference between the Biden administration and the first Trump administration. So, for instance, the Biden administration actually deported more immigrants than the first Trump administration did, right? So for some, there were such criticisms of the constitutional framework that there wasn't really so much of a democratic choice. And on that view, American democracy was already a failed democracy or some kind of hybrid. And so on that view, what we're experiencing is a little bit nothing more than more of the same. Others, of course, hold the view that we've gone from a full or robust democracy through a period of transition to what is leading possibly to authoritarianism. But where you start the story is going to have a direct bearing on your assessment of the democratic crisis, and a direct bearing on your assessment of what you need to do and what life is under a constitutional condition. Now, the argument that I've tried to make and that you have in the passage I gave you on a modern counter-revolution is, well, the argument I'm making threads a needle through these different positions. I spotlight the recurring periods in modern American history when counter-revolutionary forces took the upper hand and diminished American democracy. For instance, with the assault on human rights during the War on Terror, right? When the United States was engaged in torture, indefinite detention at Guantanamo, which we are still engaged in, drone assassinations under George W. Bush and Obama, the Obama administration. That would have been already a period of diminished democratic well-being. Or the attack on the federal bureaucracy and constitutional protections during the Reagan Revolution, perhaps, or during the Nixon years with J. Edgar Hoover's COINTELPRO program, or the purges during the McCarthy era. So I've argued that there were already moments of counter-revolutionary moments that were linked, and with direct evidence of that. And so some of the strategies and practices of the Trump administration regarding, for instance, the attack on research universities and on liberal professors, you can see as a kind of a complete, in direct continuity with the Nixon era. The enemy being liberal professors was something that was commonly touted, or the enemy being universities was something that was commonly mentioned by Nixon himself. By emphasizing those historical continuities, then, what I argue is that the flaws and weaknesses of American democracy already existed. They're not solely the product of the second mandate of President Donald Trump. But I do argue that we're now in an accentuated phase, what I call a new offensive of the counter-revolution. And I've described it as being kind of the demolition phase of that new offensive, the demolition of the administrative state. And of course, that's pushing the United States out of its democratic bounds. So I view the turn of century American democracy as having been fragile, an evolving project, but that is now really on the ropes. And that's, for me, going to affect a lot of how I think about living in these times. All right, so that's the before. Then the modes, the mechanisms, the causes of transition. So there are lots of different accounts here, too, of what's been going on with the constitutional crisis. One is, and to understand modes at this point, it's helpful to distinguish between what are called one way of transformation, which is called discrete breakdown of democracies, a discrete breakdown of democracy. And that's a form of transition. It's been studied by scholars like Adam Jaworski and others. Usually it's based on this index. It's the Bois-Miller-Rosato dichotomous coding of democracy index, which covers democracies from 1800 to 2020, identifies a specific act or a moment, a coup, an election, the passage of legislation when a democratic regime falls. So in Nazi Germany, for instance, the moment of rupture would have been March 23rd, 1933, when the Reichstag passed the law for the rectification of the distress of the nation and the Reich, which granted Hitler the power to enact laws by decree. A discrete moment in Chile, for instance, would have been on September 11th, 1973, when Pinochet led a military coup against the president at the time, Salvador Allende. If January 6th had succeeded, that would have been a date that people would associate with a discrete breakdown in American democracy. Now, you could argue here that kind of the signing of all of these executive orders, record numbers of executive orders that have taken the hatchet to the administrative state during the first months of the Trump administration, could qualify as a discrete breakdown. That would be one way of thinking about the transition. Another would be to think about democratic backsliding. That's another big term that's used here, but that involves a more gradual process that can take shape in lots of different ways. It's not unidirectional. There may be back and forth, possible returns to democracy. Erosion can take place through delegitimization of opposing parties, encouragement of violence, etc. And social scientists have been trying to identify the factors that are likely to predict backsliding. Jaworski has shown, for instance, in many statistical studies that democracies with high per capita income and a history of democratic transitions have never backslided into authoritarianism, which suggests that American democracy should not fall, at least if prior experience is any guide, or at least unless something has changed. Now, several forces can contribute then to either a discrete breakdown or this backsliding of democracy. One can be the increase of populist politics. Jan Werner Müller has written a lot about populism and shown at its core that it is a kind of rejection of pluralism and thus a real threat to democracies. Pluralism being one way of describing American democracy today. Others, though, argue that populism is not a bad thing. Some even argue that the left needs populism. So Chantal Mouffe, for instance, writes about a book for a left populism. There are other explanations, electoral realignments going on. Political polarization is something that many people are talking about. Political polarization is, the United States is described as having increased polarization over the last decade or so. Rick Pildes at NYU talks about political fragmentation, right? The fracturing of political power rather than polarization. Kim Shepley spoke to you about autocratic legalism, which is another way to describe the way that a democracy can devolve when its leaders use legal means and the veil of legal legitimacy to weaken checks and balances in a liberal democracy. Some people focus on culture and ideology more to try and show how culture wars are often presented as a cause of democratic breakdown. And then, of course, other people focus more on the underlying economic conditions, changes in digital technologies, acceleration of automation, globalization of trade that have all caused political polarization and electoral realignment. Now, in the piece that I proposed to you on the modern counter-revolution, I try to also focus on these broader social conflicts and on the economic forces that are causing the democratic crisis, rather than focusing exclusively on the rise of one individual. I think it's important to understand that these constitutional crises that you're studying are not just in the United States, but are being experienced in many other countries as well. And I think in the piece on modern counter-revolution, I discuss the gathering in Madrid in February of the Patriots, who are the far-right parliamentary members in the EU Parliament in France, Germany, England, Spain, etc. These are transformations that are taking place across continents. And so the idea is that we would need to kind of study what those causes are that could be bringing about a democratic breakdown. And what I propose is that the modern counter-revolution, in a way, should be understood as a kind of as a what's called a sinusoidal pattern, right? Resembling wavelengths. That there are historical moments, maybe during the McCarthy era, during Nixon, Hoover, during the Reagan Revolution, post 9/11, that are peaks of counter-revolutionary fervor versus as opposed to the troughs or the wave cycles. There are points at which the counter-revolution kind of comes to its apex, and then there are other points where there are recessions or troughs. And I think it's fair to say we are experiencing a counter-revolutionary apex right now. And I think you can hear it in many of the thinkers who are leading it, particularly, for instance, Christopher Rufo, conservative activist, who really acknowledges as much in the New York Times, claiming that what we're doing is really a counter-revolution. It's a revolution against revolution. And he actually has an article titled "Counter-Revolutionary Blueprint" in City Journal. And so I think that we are, in a way, at an apex in terms of this, caused by economic transformations that we need to be paying attention to, the advent of AI and other technological changes, as well as labor transformations and globalization. Okay. The third piece, then, which, you all would have to decide on, is where we are and where we are headed. How to describe American constitutionalism and democracy today, which I take it you've been thinking about all semester. So now's the time, in a way, to kind of to decide. Now, some of the proposals that are on the table and some of these readings that we have, including, for instance, Stephen Levitsky and Lucan Wei's article in Foreign Affairs that was assigned for today, talk about competitive authoritarianism. And that's one important way of thinking about where we are today in terms of competitive authoritarianism. And what that means is that there are democratic elections are being held, but the incumbent entrenches their power and effectively creates kind of unfair elections. This is by contrast to the authoritarian who does not even hold elections. In a competitive authoritarian system, there is at least the appearance of democracy, but not so much the substance. Steve Levitsky had, a lot of this is based on Max Weber's categories, the German sociologist, the really important German sociologist. And you'll recall that he used ideal types, models, to try and understand different forms of political authority. And he famously developed three categories: the traditional, based on custom, like patriarchy or hereditary monarchies; the charismatic leadership, based on a leader's personality; and the bureaucratic, based on legal rational logics, what we would think of as the American administrative state. And then he also proposed subtypes to traditional authority, which included patriarchalism and patrimonialism. And patrimonialism is very close to competitive authoritarianism, although it's that's really in its complete form. It's where the leader really treats the entire country as his own personal household. Okay, so you have one description would be competitive authoritarianism. You also have something like patrimonialism. Patrimonialism actually has been pushed very much by Jeffrey Kopstein and Stephen Hansen. They have a book called The Assault on the State: How the Global Attack on Modern Government Endangers Our Future. And they, as well as others, including Jonathan Rauch, have begun to use the term to describe President Trump's style of governing. As Rauch writes, it's running the state as if it were the leader's personal property or family business. Now, there are many other terms as well. In fact, Juan Linz, who I mentioned earlier as having coined so many of these terms, developed at least a dozen other alternative classifications for non-democratic governments in a book, Totalitarian and Authoritarian Regimes. One of them is sultanism, for instance, which has been picked up, and Wolfgang Merkel has talked about the sultanization of U.S. politics, trying to describe the new administration, hand-picked people based on loyalty criteria, family members, friends, and business partners playing a big role, lots of unbound discretion and such. Now, so those are some of the descriptions of what's going on. There's also, some people refer to the Trump administration as being somewhat kind of mobster or mafia, gangster oriented. Cornel West, of course, talks about Donald Trump as a gangster, but others as well. Balint Magyar refers to kind of post-communist mafia states, particularly in Hungary right now. And then actually Kim Shepley implicitly draws the parallels to the present moment in the United States. Then, of course, there's the term fascist, and that, in a way, is the nuclear option here in these discussions. You have it from Timothy Snyder in On Tyranny. He believes that we're witnessing fascism in the United States right now. Jason Stanley, as well, in How Fascism Works, also assigned for today, warns us as well of a gradual, ongoing descent into fascism. Naomi Klein and Astra Taylor write about the end time fascism. Particularly interesting essay that you read, describing how kind of far right oligarchs such as Peter Thiel or Elon Musk have been adopting a kind of supremacist, survivalist approach in the face of global climate warming. So those are the endpoint alternatives. The one that I've been developing with this idea of a modern counter-revolution is something that would lead to an authoritarian state with concentrated powers in the hands of a small group formed principally around President Trump, including his cabinet, especially his attorney general, now his war secretary and his secretary of state, but also the inner circle at the White House. So Stephen Miller, Vice President J.D. Vance, and others. Recall that the basic idea of counterinsurgency theory is that it expresses a simple tenet of the exercise of political power. Those are the words of David Galula, a French commander who developed counterinsurgency theory in the 1950s. And he summarized it in this way. In any situation, whatever the cause, there will be an active minority for the cause, a neutral majority, and an active minority against the cause. The technique of power consists in relying on the favorable minority in order to rally the neutral majority and to neutralize or eliminate the hostile minority. And I think you can see that, and that's the idea of eliminating internal enemies, of course, and winning the hearts and minds of the people. I think you can hear that and feel that in a lot of what's being done in terms of creating internal enemies, whether it's LGBTQ community or immigrants in this country, and or liberal professors or federal workers, but and eventually eliminating them. So that would be kind of like a framework which, in a way, now in the conclusion, you all might want to pick and choose what you think is going on from the before through the transitions to the after. I find the model of the counter-revolution offering a clear view, kind of, and a pretty helpful way of understanding a lot of what's been going on, but also a path forward in terms of how to live through this period, because I would say that history tends to show that when people retain their values, counter-revolutions rarely succeed. And so that then brings us, then in conclusion, to just a few thoughts about what we are called upon to do. Tim Snyder gives us these 20 lessons. Of the 20 lessons, I thought the ones that were most powerful and spoke to me the most are the first, do not obey in advance. I think that is something that is very easy to do, and that one feels can be helpful for one's own safety and well-being. But I think, in a way, as Snyder suggests, obeying in advance facilitates these transformations, allows them to happen, encourages them, and gives them even more momentum than they would have otherwise. I think the fourth is important. Take responsibility for the face of the world. And the way in which he speaks about the way in which, when there are signs defacing a university or the street, how important it is for oneself to take responsibility to cover those signs, or to take them down, or to do things oneself, to take responsibility for the way that the world looks and what is said. And perhaps the most important is the last one, which is the 20th one, which is to be as courageous as you can be. And on that note, then, I wanted to kind of conclude with a story about someone who did that, who was very courageous. His name was Aristide de Souza Mendes. Let me see if I can share my image here. Aristide de Souza Mendes, who it turned out was a Portuguese consul in southern France, and he was tasked with the Bordeaux region, and in 1938 he was essentially told that he couldn't grant any visas anymore, or that the only way to grant visas was to send them to the Foreign Affairs Office in the capital of Portugal, which of course would take a couple of months to get back. And it's now June 1940, France, and there are tens of thousands, possibly 2 million refugees who have kind of clustered in what is like the bottom southwest pocket of France, the Basque Country, caught between the Spanish border, which Franco wouldn't allow anyone across the border, and the advancing Nazi German army. And so he had thousands of immigrants who were asking for visas, and he wasn't able to deliver any of them. And he was a very Catholic man, had 14 children, lived with him. And he went into a crisis, really, a crisis mode. He went in, he secluded himself for 3 days, 3 days and 3 nights, and just couldn't deal with his conscience. And when he came out of his study, he decided that he would just sign visas. And he started this process. He got his kids kind of lined up, because it was almost an industrial process where, the kids would take a passport, one would stamp it, one would pass it to him, and then he would sign it. And he started signing visas. And he ended up signing visas that allowed approximately 30,000 people to escape France in 1940. And to get to Portugal. And it's actually thanks to him that my father, who was age 12 at the time, was able to escape France. He was one of the fortunate ones. And you see his signature here. That's his signature on the right. It's a tired signature. He had a much more august signature when he was signing in beginning of June, but he was able to scribble his name, Mendes, on this visa. And thanks to him, thanks to him, I'm here speaking to you about constitutional crises. So what can we do? How should we act? I think it's incumbent on all of us to show as much courage as you can, as Timothy Snyder says, and to act in the face of what may be a growing crisis. So I thank you for inviting me. Michael, and look forward to the conversation.
Well, we thank you enormously for all of that. We'll take our usual very short break